Good morning. Can you hear me okay? On August 4th, 2020, Carlton Weekly was shopping for a birthday gift for his young son. Carlton Weekly was a well-known Chicago drill rapper who went by the name FBG Duck. He was also a high-profile gang member. That afternoon, Carlton Weekly, or FBG Duck, went down to Oak Street, a block of boutiques in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. He stopped at Dolce & Gabbana. At that time, Dolce & Gabbana limited the number of customers inside the store, so Duck joined the short line out front on the sidewalk. That afternoon, Duck had driven to Oak Street with his friend, Cache Williams. While he waited outside of Dolce & Gabbana, she sat in her car parked right in front of the store. Devon Brinson was also on Oak Street that day. He had to return a shirt to Dolce & Gabbana, so he walked down that sidewalk and got in line behind Duck. And what none of them knew as they stood waiting on that sidewalk as shoppers and joggers passed by was that members of O Block, a bitter gang rivalry of Ducks, were already on their way. They were racing from the south side of Chicago to Oak Street in a 2-car caravan. They dressed in dark clothing, and they were armed with multiple guns. They had one mission: to kill Duck, also known as Carlton Weekly. Members of O Block had been tipped off about Duck's location on Oak Street that day by defendant Ralph Turpin. Earlier that afternoon, Duck had stopped by another shop on Oak Street. Turpin happened to see him there. Turpin knew who Duck was. He disliked Duck, and he knew that O Block wanted Duck dead. So as Turpin stood by waiting, watching, those 2 cars drove up on Oak Street. They slowed in front of Dolce & Gabbana, and the drivers waited ready for the getaway. The remaining defendants jumped out of those cars, and they chased Duck down in a hail of bullets. They surrounded him and continued to shoot him over and over again, even after he collapsed, bleeding and dying on the street. They shot him 16 times. He had bullet wounds in his neck, in his chest, in his hands, in his arms, in his back, and in both of his legs. They killed him. Cache Williams, who was with Duck that day, was shot twice. And Devon Brinson, who was there in the wrong place at the wrong time, was shot 3 times, including in his back, as he ran for his life. He was critically injured, but he survived. The 6 defendants sitting before you committed this brazen and ruthless shooting together. And this morning, I'm going to walk you through and give you an overview of the government's case. To start, Your Honor, may I publish my sides up to the jury? Yes. Thank you. Judge, I'm sorry, our screen, the one in front of Mr. Greenberg, is not on. Yes, Your Honor, I don't believe anyone in the courtroom can see the slide. Actually, I'm sorry, can you see? No, the one in front of Mr. Greenberg is dead. The one in front of Mr. Robertson is actually working. Don't worry about me for now, Judge. I'm good. I can see it. Okay. Thanks for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. This morning, I'm going to give you an overview of the government's case. We're going to start with discussing the defendants, who they are. Next, I will walk you through the charges against these defendants. Then, to understand the reason behind the shooting, why they killed Weekly and shot 2 others, you need to understand O Block. So we'll talk this morning about the O Block street gang, what it is, what it does, and its bitter rivalry with Duck's gang. Then I will give you a summary of the evidence I expect you to hear over the course of this trial. It will walk you through how August 4th unfolded. And finally, I will discuss how this case is going to be presented to you by the government, the types of evidence you can expect to see over the course of this trial. So let's begin with the defendants. On August 4th, 5 of the defendants sitting before you got in 2 cars and they drove from the south side of Chicago to Oak Street to kill Carlton Weekly, or FBG Duck. These 5 defendants are members or associates of O Block, a violent street gang on Chicago's south side. They are Charles Liggins, who goes by the nickname C-Murder. Liggins is sitting in the back row to your left, ladies and gentlemen. He is a member and leader of O Block. Kenneth Robertson, who goes by Kenny or Kenny Mac, is seated in the front row to your right. Robertson is a close associate of O Block. He's a member of Dipset, another Black Disciple gang faction that is allied with O Block, and he's aided and abetted the other O Block members in that shooting. The third person who drove to Oak Street that day is to Carlos Orford, who goes by the nickname Los and raps under the name Losa Dosa. Orford is seated in the back row to your right. He is a member of O Block. Christopher Thomas, or C-Thing. Christopher Thomas is also a member of O Block. He is seated in the middle row on the right. Marcus Smart was the 5th defendant that went down to Oak Street that day. He goes by the nickname Muwap. And Smart is seated in the middle row on your right. Your left, excuse me. The 6th defendant before you today is Ralph Turpin. He goes by the nickname Tall Ortizi. Turpin is seated in the front row to your left. Now, Turpin is not a member of O Block. He's affiliated with another Black Disciple Street gang. But Turpin knew who Duck was. He knew that O Block wanted him dead, and his information set the shooting in motion. He aided and abetted this murder. Let's turn now to the charges in this case. Now, the defendants are presumed innocent of all charges. We, the government, have the burden to prove the defendants guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And after the parties' opening statements today, you will begin to hear the evidence that will prove that each of these defendants are guilty as charged. There are 7 different charges in the superseding indictment. All 6 defendants are charged in count 1 and 3 of the indictment. Count 1 charges these defendants with the August 4th, 2020 murder of Carlton Weekly, also known as FBG Duck. And count 3 charges them in the conspiracy to murder Weekly, or FBG Duck. Now, the 5 defendants who drove to Oak Street committed these crimes, committed this murder and this conspiracy to murder because they wanted to maintain or increase their position in O Block, a violent street gang, and a criminal enterprise. Defendant Turpin aided and abetted that murder and that conspiracy to murder by providing Duck's location that got back to those defendants. And the rest of the counts in the indictment, counts 2 and counts 4 through 7, relate to the victims who were shot. These charges are against the 5 defendants who drove to Oak Street. That's Charles Liggins, Kenneth Robertson, to Carlos Orford, Christopher Thomas, and Marcus Smart. While these defendants went to Oak Street with the plan to kill Duck, in that process, they shot 2 others, Cache Williams and Devon Brinson. Count 2 of the superseding indictment charges these 5 defendants with discharging a firearm to commit Carlton Weekly, or FBG Duck's murder and causing his death. Counts 4 and 5 of the indictment relate to the shooting of Devon Brinson. Count 4 is assault with a dangerous weapon, and count 5 is discharging a firearm and the shooting of Brinson. The final charges, counts 6 and 7, relate to the shooting of Cache Williams. Count 6 is assault with a dangerous weapon for the shooting of Williams, and count 7 relates to discharging a firearm in that shooting. And as I've mentioned, the reason why the defendants drove to Oak Street that day was they wanted to kill Carlton Weekly, or FBG Duck, to maintain or increase their position in O Block, a street gang on the south side of Chicago. So to understand the shooting, we need to talk about O Block. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence at this trial will show that O Block is a criminal enterprise. It has leaders, it has members, and it has expectations for those members. One of its leaders is defendant Charles Liggins. O Block controlled Parkway Gardens, which is a large apartment complex on the south side of Chicago. It controlled the illegal drug dealing that happened at Parkway Gardens, and O Block members were expected to pay dues and to contribute money to the gang. That money went to purchase communal guns and to pay bonds to get other O Block members out of jail. O Block had a simple mission. They wanted to be respected and they wanted to be feared in the streets and online on social media. Members of O Block committed crimes to further their goals. Over the course of this trial, you will hear about some of those crimes. They include murder, assault, and narcotics distribution. O Block members also bragged about their association on social media and in rap music. On social media and in their rap music, they will claim responsibility for acts of violence, brag about O Block's violent acts, and they would taunt rival gang members. This social media and rap music taunting acted like gasoline on fire. It fueled existing rivalries, and it led to real acts of violence and death. One O Block leader and member who was a successful rapper was a man named Devon Benton, who rapped under the name King Von. King Von was a leader of O Block until his death in November 2020, 3 months after Weekly's murder. King Von financed guns and he supplied cash to O Block. He also purchased custom diamond encrusted O Block pendants for himself and other members of O Block, including defendant Liggins and defendant Smart. These chains cost between $6,000 and $30,000 each, and there were status symbols in O Block. They were reserved for the top members of the gang and for shooters, members who were known to shoot at rival gang members. Now, each of the 5 defendants that drove to Oak Street that day broadcast their association with O Block. Defendant Liggins and Smart owned their O Block chains. You will see these chains during trial. Defendant Orford wore a chain, an O Block chain, in a rap music video he produced. These 5 defendants also broadcast their association with O Block on social media, including in the social media names themselves. For example, this is the defendant Thomas, whose Instagram name was O Block 64 C Thing. Thomas' nickname is C Thing. This is a post from 4 days after the shooting with the caption, "Baby, I'm O Block, I ain't average." And defendant Robertson, an O Block associate, called O Block his second home, and he included O Block in his Instagram profile alongside his gang, Dipset, and other gangs that were allied with O Block. Now, to talk about the rivalry between O Block and Duck's gang, STL, we need to go back in time because this rivalry has gone on for over a decade. So O Block is a faction of the Black Disciples street gang. It got its name in 2011 to honor O.D. Perry, who was a member killed by the STL gang member killed by a member of Weekly's gang or Duck's gang. Before it was O Block, the gang still existed. It controlled Parkway Gardens. It had the same structure and many of the same members, but it went by different names. And one of O Block's rivals were STL. This is Duck's gang. XTL is a faction of the Gangster Disciples, which has a long-time rivalry with O Block. This rivalry is about territory and proximity. STL stands for St. Lawrence Avenue, which is the center of STL's territory on St. Lawrence and 63rd on the south side of Chicago. This is just blocks from Parkway Gardens, the area O Block controls. And this rivalry has gone on for over a decade. That decade is marked with retaliatory murders between these gangs. And over the course of the trial, you will hear about some of those murders. Murders that were committed by O Block to retaliate against Duck's gang, STL, and to assert O Block's power. But O Block and STL are not the only gang names you will hear during the course of this trial. That is because O Block created alliances with other Black disciple street gangs or clicked up with those gangs. Those include Dipset, which is defendant Robertson's gang. It also includes gangs like THF, 600, and Lamron. By forming alliances or clicking up with other gang factions, these gangs took on O Block's rivals like STL and vice versa. During the course of this trial, we will hear from the current and former members of O Block and a former member of FCL, Duck's gang. These witnesses will tell you about the history of the rivalry, and they will discuss O Block operations and how it functions. Now, these witnesses are deep in O Block's world, and they have done some bad things. When they testify, they will tell you about crimes they have committed as members of these gangs. You will also hear the term cooperator during trial. Several of the government witnesses are cooperating with the government, and they may expect or have received some benefit. The judge will have you caution you to treat these cooperators' testimony with care. And when they testify, they will explain to you what benefit, if any, they had received or expect to receive. Earlier I mentioned that O Block had the expectation for its members. One important expectation that O Block members were to seek out and shoot opposition gang members or ops. Shooting and killing opposition gang members got an O Block member respect within the gang. The bigger the op, the bigger the viral. The more respect that member got. And Carlton Weekly, or FBG Duck, was a big viral for O Block. Weekly was a 26-year-old father and a successful rap artist. Before his death, one of his hit songs was played over 50 million times on YouTube. And Weekly was also a popular and well-known member of O Block's rival, STL. In his rap music, Duck would rap about his gang association, and he would disrespect O Block, taunting those members. For example, just weeks before the murder on Oak Street, Duck put out a song called Dead Bitches. This song disrespected O Block. It named at least 6 dead members or associates of O Block, and is mocked the manner in which those people have died. This song was also personal to defendant Charles Liggins, because in the song, Duck rapped about the death of Liggins' brother, Sherrod. So that brings us back to August 4th, 2020. That afternoon, Duck and his friend, Cache Williams, drove down to Oak Street in Cache Williams' car. Duck brought along his handgun, but he left it in the car. While he shopped, Williams waited in the car parked on Oak Street. There is a significant surveillance footage in this case. Over the course of the trial, you will see that footage. And footage from Oak Street and other places, including Parkway Gardens, will show you minute by minute how that afternoon unfolded. When Duck was on Oak Street, he stopped by a store called Milani. Milani is a children's boutique. When he was there inside the store, defendant Turpin and his friend also entered the store. While inside Milani, Turpin placed a call. He provided Duck's location to others. At approximately 4:02 p.m., surveillance footage at Parkway Gardens showed the remaining defendants. Parkway Gardens surveillance footage showed defendant offered near his car a black Ford Fusion, which is one of the cars that is used in the murder. At 4:02, the remaining defendants, Charles Liggins, Christopher Thomas, Kenneth Robertson, and Marcus Smart, are seen scrambling. They rush up an internal staircase at Parkway Gardens, and they reappear moments later. Some of the defendants have now changed into dark clothing, including hats and hoodies, sweatshirts, and jackets, despite the warm August day. Meanwhile, back at Oak Street, Duck is still inside the store with Turpin. A short time later, at approximately 4:05, Duck exits Milani. Back at Oak Street, at approximately 4:06, you will see the two cars used in the murder, the black Ford Fusion, Orford's car, and Robertson's gray Chrysler 300, leaving the Parkway Gardens parking lot. Approximately a minute later, defendant Turpin exits Milani, the children's store. You will hear in Turpin's own words what he did when he was inside that children's boutique. Because after he left Milani, he went to another store, and inside that store, he placed a call. Security guards at the store thought he was acting suspicious, so they recorded him. During this trial, you will hear that recording. In Turpin's own words, he explained, "We see Duck. We slide in the little Milani boutique." Turpin says that while in Milani, I already got folks in them on the phone. They're on their way. Turpin talks about how he told the people he called in Milani that Duck had left the store. According to Turpin, the people on that call told him to follow Duck outside to see what kind of car Duck was getting into. At that time, Turpin left Milani's. He understood they were on their way. Turpin also had another incident happen to him while he was on Oak Street. But what's important to remember is that incident is unrelated to this shooting and murder. This incident occurred after Turpin had placed the call to provide Duck's location and after the other defendants had already left Parkway Gardens to drive to Oak Street. When Turpin left Milani, that children's boutique, an unknown man pulled a gun on him. Turpin ran, and the man with the gun got in a car and left. When police officers responded to that incident, they didn't see the man with the gun or the car. And when they tried to talk to Turpin about it, he just blew them off. And most importantly, Turpin didn't leave Oak Street after this happened. You see, he had driven his car to Oak Street that day. It was right there. But instead of leaving, he stayed. He waited to ensure that the defendants came and shot Duck. And as Turpin understood, when he was on that recorded call, they were on their way. The defendants were on their way from the south side of Chicago to Oak Street. Those two cars moved through traffic, and at one point, they ran a red light to stay together. At 4:19 p.m., defendant Robertson texts with an associate. At this point, those cars are on the route to Oak Street. This associate was trying to return a gun to Robertson. Robertson told the associate to take the gun to Parkway Gardens, or the O, because we on Duck right now. We on Duck right now. Meanwhile, unaware of what was about to happen, Duck got in line outside of Dolce & Gabbana. Williams waited in her car in front of the store, and Devon Brinson, there to return a shirt, got in line right behind Duck. Surveillance footage on Oak Street shows the two cars pulled up at 4:26 p.m. The drivers wait in the cars for the getaway. The remaining defendants jump out of the car. They chase Duck down. They shot over and over and over again. In that process, they shoot Cache Williams twice and Devon Brinson 3 times. The defendants fire over 30 shots on the sidewalk. They then jump back in those cars and they sped away. It took less than 27 minutes from the time defendant Ralph Turpin saw Duck inside a children's boutique for the remaining defendants to hunt him down and shoot him dead. Now, the shooting itself took less than 20 seconds. In that short amount of time, the surviving victims and the eyewitnesses could not identify the defendants as the shooters, and no witnesses at trial would identify the defendants in the surveillance footage of the shooting itself. However, The 2 cars they used in the shooting were identified. They were captured on surveillance footage, speeding away from Oak Street immediately after the shooting. Those surveillance footage and license plate reader technologies, law enforcement was able to identify these 2 cars, a black Ford Fusion registered to Carlos Orford and a gray Chrysler 300 registered to Kenneth Robertson. From there, law enforcement was able to track the path of these cars, both before the murder from Parkway Gardens to Oak Street, as well as their flight after the shooting. Before the shooting, Parkway Gardens surveillance footage captured those 5 defendants that drove to Oak Street. Orford is seen on the surveillance footage at and around his Ford Fusion, the car used in the shooting. The remaining defendants, Smart, Robertson, Liggins, and Thomas, are also captured in Parkway Gardens surveillance footage. That footage shows these 4 defendants hustling to get ready. They run up an internal staircase and they reappear minutes later. Now, Smart, Liggins, and Thomas are dressed in all dark clothing, with hats and hoodies and long-sleeve jackets to hide their identities. Witnesses who know these defendants personally, including a family member, a Parkway Garden security guard, a former girlfriend, and members of O Block will identify these defendants in that surveillance footage. You will not see, however, surveillance footage of these 5 individuals getting into the car used in the murder, Orford Ford Fusions and Robertson's Chrysler 300. But you will see the footage of those cars leaving the Parkway Gardens parking lot and their travel to Oak Street. And you will see their flight after the shooting. And importantly, you will see footage and hear testimony of just who got out of the cars after the shooting. Evidence at this trial will show that a total of 6 people drove in those 2 cars to Oak Street, 2 drivers and 4 shooters. Now, 5 of those members who were in those cars are sitting before you today. The 6th person who drove to Oak Street has died. He died before this case was charged, so he's not a part of this case today. Now, let's discuss what happened after the shooting and who was in each of these 2 cars. After the shooting, the 2 cars split up on Oak Street. Orford's black Ford Fusion drove straight to a car dealership where Orford had recently purchased the car. He had to return the Ford Fusion because his car loan had been declined. The car dealership had been following up with him over the past day to try to get the car back, but it was not until minutes after the shooting that he let the dealership know that he was on his way. Orford also told the mother of his child to meet him at the dealership to pick him up. Orford arrived at the car dealership driving the Ford Fusion. His child's mother picked him up and defended Smart along with the deceased man, and she drove the 3 of them to the home of another O Block member. Meanwhile, after the shooting, Robertson's Chrysler 300 drove straight back to Parkway Gardens. Surveillance footage at the Parkway Gardens captured Robertson exiting the driver's side of the Chrysler 300 and defendant Liggins and Thomas exit from the passenger side doors. Witnesses who know these 3 men personally will identify them in that footage. Footage from Parkway Gardens also captured the 3 of them running through the complex after getting out of that Chrysler. But that's not all. A shell casing was found in the windshield wiper, Robertson's Chrysler 300. That shell casing matched the shell casings found at the scene of the murder on Oak Street. And Robertson's cell phone, the cell phone that he used to text that associate, we on Duck, that cell phone has location information. And that location information showed a path of travel of that cell phone from Parkway Gardens to Oak Street. Being at Oak Street at the time of the shooting and then traveling from Oak Street back to Parkway Gardens afterwards. After the shooting, 2 of the defendants also bragged about their involvement. Defendant Turpin texted his child's mother that evening after the shooting, after Duck shooting, 3 laughing emojis. You see, his child's mother had recently got out of a year-long relationship with Duck. Turpin's text was out of the blue and unusual. And defendant Robertson at 4:40 p.m., less than 20 minutes after the shooting, and before Robertson had even returned to Parkway Gardens, he texted associate, check Spot News. Spot News is a local news website that tracks Chicago's crime. At 5:20 on August 4th, the same day after the shooting, he texted a link to the associate about Duck's shooting. He also bragged to the associate he had told on the way to the shooting, "We on Duck." He bragged to that individual that he and others had shot Duck, and he said he was offered an O Block chain after the murder. Now that I walk you through some of the evidence, I expect you will hear about the shooting. I want to talk about how that case is going to be presented. This case will take several weeks, while the facts themselves are rather straightforward. There are a large number of witnesses that you will hear from. Some have a lot to talk about, and some will testify about a narrow topic. There will also be times when you may hear about one defendant's name more than the other. That may be because some of these witnesses are going to have to testify out of order. And so the judge instructed you, I encourage you to use your notebooks to take notes on the testimony that you hear and the evidence that you see. Now let's talk about briefly the type of evidence I expect that you will hear and see during this trial. As I mentioned, there is a lot of surveillance footage in this case. Security cameras on Oak Street captured the moment before the shooting and the shooting itself. Surveillance footage throughout the Parkway Gardens complex captured O Block members and associates before and after the shooting. And police cameras, or POD cameras, captured those 2 cars driving from Parkway Gardens to Oak Street and then fleeing the shooting afterwards. You will also hear from the survivors of this shooting, as well as other eyewitnesses who were on Oak Street that day. A number of witnesses who will testify will identify the defendants in surveillance footage from before and after the shooting. You will also hear from law enforcement agents and officers about how this investigation unfolded and the evidence that they collected. The government will also call witnesses who will testify about specialized areas. This includes about Robertson's cell phone and its location at the time of the shooting, and the testimony about the shell casings found on Robertson's car that matched shell casings at the scene of the shooting. During this trial, you will also hear and see portions of rap music by the victim, FBG Duck, rap music by some of the defendants, as well as King Vaughn, one of O Block members and leaders. You will also see social media evidence and hear testimony about text messages sent by the defendant. There are also recorded calls that capture the defendants talking about some of the activity they did for O Block. And finally, you will see crime scene photos and evidence that will show how the defendants committed this assault. O Block bitter gang rivalry with STL and Duck led to this vicious and ruthless shooting. When Turpin's information that Duck was on Oak Street got back to the remaining defendants, they had one mission: to get to Oak Street as fast as they could and kill Duck, kill Carlton Weekly. This is why they raced to Oak Street in their own cars and why they fired 30 rounds, over 30 rounds on that sidewalk in broad daylight. The evidence will show that the reason why those 5 defendants that drove to Oak Street wanted to kill Duck, kill Carlton Weekly, was because they wanted to maintain or increase their position in O Block. Defendant Turpin aided and abetted that mission because its information on where Duck was set the shooting in motion. At the end of this trial, my partners will have a chance to speak with you again. and they will ask you to return the only verdict that is consistent with all the evidence in this case, that these 6 defendants, Charles Liggins, Kenneth Robinson, Carlos Orford, Christopher Thomas, Marcus Smart, and Ralph Turpin, are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you.